Today I'm going to be teaching you how to make goat milk mozzarella. Most of the popular recipes and techniques for mozzarella don't tend to work so well with goat milk. Why? Well, goat milk is a more fragile milk. It has smaller fat globules, which makes it easier to digest, but also means that you need to exercise more care when using it for cheese making. From personal experience, I can tell you that not a single quick mozzarella recipe has ever turned out a tasty mozzarella with lots of flavor and the perfect texture. They've all either been bland and gelatinous or tough and grainy and not melty one bit. This recipe is different than those quick ones, yet still provides a delicious and flavorful melty mozzarella, still within a rather short period of time. No microwaves, no boiling gallons of salted whey, and no relying on just citric acid to acidify the milk. This recipe I'm sharing today is a hybrid recipe, which means you get the best of both worlds. We're going to use both freeze-dried cultures and citric acid to acidify the milk. This means a rapid acidifying process, as well as authentic mozzarella flavor and texture. I'm using raw milk from my herd of Mini Nubian goats. You can use cow or sheep milk for this recipe too. Just keep in mind that with cow milk, you'll need to stir and stretch longer than with goat or sheep milk. I'm starting with 4 gallons of raw milk, but feel free to halve or quarter this recipe as needed. We're going to start by warming up half of the milk to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, leaving the remaining 2 gallons chilled. Once the milk has reached 90 degrees, it's time to stir in both of the cultures. We're using a mesophilic and a thermophilic culture for this recipe, as they both work to acidify and give flavor at different temperatures and stages of the cheese making. I'm using MM100 and TA61, both from New England Cheesemaking. Sprinkle the cultures evenly across the top of the milk. Allow them to rehydrate for a minute or two, and then stir into the milk with a gentle up-down motion. Leave the milk to culture for 30 minutes. After our 2 gallons of warm milk has cultured, it's time to acidify the remaining cold milk with citric acid. Mix 2 teaspoons of citric acid into a 1/4 cup of cool, non-chlorinated water and stir into the cold milk. You can do this in a pot or while the milk is still in jars. Then add the cold milk into the warm milk and stir to incorporate them. Now we're going to heat the 4 gallons of milk back up to about 90 degrees. A chef alarm thermometer comes in handy here to make sure you don't overheat the milk. Now it's time to add the rennet. Mix 1 teaspoon of liquid animal rennet into a 1/4 cup of cool, non-chlorinated water. I like to pour the rennet over a slotted spoon or spatula to evenly disperse it across the milk. Gently stir the milk with an up-down motion, trying not to break the surface of the milk if you can. Stir for about a minute and then leave the milk to set into a curd for about 30 minutes or until you achieve a clean break. While I'm waiting for the milk to coagulate, I like to wash out all of my milk jars and get the kitchen clean again so I have plenty of counter space. You'll need room for a cutting board and a few large bowls on the counter too when it's time to stretch the curds, so it's nice to make room for all that now. After about 30 minutes, it's time to check the curd. You can see here I have a nice clean break. I'm going to start with vertical cuts in the curd. With mozzarella, we're not too worried about perfectly sized curds, so try not to stress too much about these cuts. I'm making the vertical cuts about 1 inch apart. Then I'll leave the curds to rest for 5 minutes before making my next set of cuts. This rest between cuts is especially important for goat milk cheeses to achieve the best yields and texture. Now it's time to make our horizontal cuts. These cuts are a little harder to make now because, as you can see, the whey has seeped out and is covering the top of the curds. That's okay, just do the best you can to make the cuts about 1 inch apart, horizontally, all the way across the pot. Then allow the curds to rest for another 5 minutes. Now we'll make the final series of cuts to turn this grid of curds into cubes. I like to do this using a skimmer spoon or spatula. Normally, when you're making a hard cheese, it's important to be as precise as possible with the curd cuts and get them all down to approximately the same size. But with mozzarella, this really isn't a big concern. So we'll just make a few cuts across the curds beneath the surface and call it good. Now give a gentle stir to start bringing the curds at the bottom of the pot up to the top. Don't worry about cutting any uneven or overly large curds down to size. At this point, we're going to begin some gentle stirring. Over the next 30 minutes, we're going to gradually raise the temperature to 110 degrees, all while stirring gently and infrequently. So what I like to do for this part is set a 10-minute timer and shoot to raise the temperature by 6 or 7 degrees by the time the timer goes off. Be careful not to overstir the curds. Goat milk requires less agitation than cow milk, and mozzarella is a fairly hands-off recipe when it comes to stirring anyway. Okay, so now the 30 minutes are up and my curds have reached 110 degrees. The curds should be starting to clump together a bit, and they should also begin to look kind of stretchy and a little shiny. Leave them for 10 minutes or so to settle at the bottom of the pot before straining them out of the whey. I like to save my whey to feed our pig and chickens. You can also use whey to soak grains, dilute it to fertilize the garden, or even keep it to make ricotta. Whatever you choose to do with the whey, go ahead and pour it off now. Place the mozzarella curds into a colander and set it inside the pot. You can use cheesecloth if you like, just be sure to get it wet with some whey first so that the curds don't stick. I've since decided I like placing the curds directly in the colander without the cheesecloth, or even directly in the pot without a colander. We're going to let the curds sit and continue to culture and acidify in the colander for about 30 minutes. I like to fill a gallon Ziploc bag with warm water and place it on top of the curds to help them maintain their temperature while they sit. While the curds are mellowing in the colander, go ahead and prep your supplies for stretching. You'll need a large cutting board and knife, a pair of food-safe rubber gloves, I get mine from New England Cheesemaking, a large bowl or two filled with ice water, and a pot for heating water to stretch the curds in. Once the curds have mellowed for about 30 minutes, it's time to stretch them. Heat a pot of water up to 180 degrees Fahrenheit. Pull the mass of curds out of the colander and cut them into chunks. You want the pieces of curd to be about as big as can easily fit into one hand. Place one of the curd pieces into the hot water and let it sit for about a minute. You want to wait until the curd is hot enough to be pliable, but not so hot that it's melting. Check it every 30 seconds or so. You'll know it's hot enough when the curd stretches easily without breaking. Now, you may have seen videos of mozzarella making before, or maybe read recipes that call for pulling and stretching the curds as far as you can. Well, that process works great for cow's milk and is also a lot of fun. But in my experience, that sort of stretching makes goat milk mozzarella tough. The key to making a goat milk mozzarella with the perfect texture is to not overstretch the curds. A short stretch and then folding the curd over on itself a few times is plenty. You can see I'm stretching and folding the curd over a couple times, dipping it into the hot water as needed to keep it pliable. Then I'm shaping it into a ball. Once the mozzarella has been stretched and then shaped, you can pop it into the bowl of ice water to cool. To make string cheese, you can stretch and fold the curds over onto themselves a few times, and then begin to roll the cheese into a snake shape between your palms or on the cutting board. If you want a cheese that's really stringy, make sure you fold it over on itself several times to create those strands. Roll it into a log until it's about the thickness of a store-bought string cheese, then let it cool in the ice water. We like to make about half of our mozzarella into balls for slicing and shredding, and half into string cheese for snacking. But feel free to make the mozzarella into whatever shapes you prefer. Once all the curds have been stretched and shaped, and they've sufficiently cooled, it's time to place them in a salt brine. We're going to be using a saturated brine for this recipe. A simple recipe for a saturated brine is to mix 1 gallon of non-chlorinated water with 2 1/4 pounds of non-iodized salt. Then stir in a tablespoon of calcium chloride and a teaspoon of white vinegar. If you already have a saturated brine on hand for making other cheeses, just go ahead and use that. Let the mozzarella sit in the saturated brine until it's reached your preferred level of saltiness. For my family, this is about 1 to 1.5 hours for string cheese and 2 to 3 hours for mozzarella balls. If your cheese ends up too salty, you can always rinse it or soak it in some milk before eating to help remove some of the saltiness. So there you have it, a simple recipe that's perfectly suited for making goat milk mozzarella that doesn't sacrifice texture or flavor. We love to use this mozzarella on homemade pizza, lasagna, quesadillas, or in any other recipe where we need a good melty cheese. The kids love it for snacking, and it makes a super easy on-the-go protein. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. If you enjoyed this recipe, please like and subscribe to make sure you don't miss out on more goat milk cheese making videos. For the written tutorial and links to ingredients and supplies, be sure to check out the blog post for this recipe linked below or on my website at thenestinthewest.com. There you can find more helpful resources as well as my course all about goat milk cheese making beyond Chev. I'd love to hear if you tried this recipe, so please reach out or leave a comment if you do. Until next time, happy cheese making!